broken. I don't want to play with you anymore. It's fine. It's fine. Don't worry about it. But over the past year, you've heard me complain a lot about the limitations of iPadOS and how, yeah, there's been some improvement with the hardware, but there's really nothing wrong with the original hardware, which is now over 3 years old, and the software just can't catch up. So once again, in today's video, I'm talking about the iPad's identity and what it's limited to and what Apple sees its future in. Let's begin. So yeah, for the longest time I was advocating as to why I think it would be such a great thing if the iPad Pro could dual boot into macOS. In the past, Apple was very, very comfortable with you dual booting your Mac into third-party operating systems like Windows, and the only reason you can't do that on Apple Silicon is because of Microsoft. It's not necessarily Apple's fault. They're totally open to the idea if Microsoft was willing to play ball, but that's why it makes logical sense to me that Apple would be okay with first-party operating systems being an option, not a requirement, not something everybody needed. In fact, I would be totally fine if they restricted it to just the Pro iPads or just the 12.9-inch iPads or heck, just the mini LED iPads, because there's only one, just to preserve their Mac sales, just so they don't cannibalize too many Mac sales. But honestly, now that the Mac line has gotten so many of the features I love on my iPad Pro, now we've got the 120 Hertz, we've got the Apple efficiency. You know, I took my MacBook Pro on my last vacation, never charged it once, and we used it, you know, quite a bit. We were watching movies and shows with it. I was showing it to friends and family members that we visited. And during that full 8 days, it only went down to 50%. Like, it could have kept going. The speaker quality on it is amazing. And yes, it's substantially more expensive than the iPad Pro. But once you consider that a lot of these larger size iPads that Apple is advertising, you get a pencil or 5G or the Magic Keyboard case, they're actually selling some of these higher end iPads for, you know, $1,500, $1,900. Once you start opting for the 1 terabyte or 2 terabyte options, you're quickly near $3,000 on an iPad setup. And frankly, the number of things that iPad Pro can do that this 2018 iPad Pro, which cost a third of the price new, if you buy it refurbished, it's probably more like a fifth of the price, can still do the exact same thing is kind of shocking to me. I mean, I know that certain products kind of mature and they kind of peak and run out of new features to add, but in my opinion, the iPad is what's most desperate for any type of new software update that could actually take advantage of the new hardware. And because the MacBook now has the high dynamic range, it has the speed, it has the great battery life, now they even returned a bunch of the ports people care about, I'm using my iPad Pro less and less. You know, I didn't take it on my vacation, and frankly, I didn't miss it. You know, there's always a certain intuitiveness and user-friendliness that I'll appreciate about iPadOS and how simple it is to manage separate apps and have multitasking, and I think that's perfectly acceptable for the mid-range and lower end iPads. You know, I think iPadOS is perfect for devices like the iPad mini, it's perfect for the iPad Air, and of course the budget iPad. For all of what is capable on those devices and the silicon inside them, I think iPadOS has it covered. But what's losing me, and I'm seeing less and less purpose in, is the iPad Pro line, particularly when you buy new. Of course, I recommend to people all the time finding certified refurbished 2018 iPad Pros, because you can get pretty much all of those, even 2020 iPad Pros, for well under $1,000, and they do so much of the same stuff that the new iPad Pros do for much less money. And as long as Apple wants to continue having the same operating system across all of these different devices, it's very, very hard for me to justify ever upgrading this thing. The reason I kind of wanted to make this video is I think I'm kind of having this realization moment that's kind of crazy. I've owned this iPad for over 3 years, which actually, looking back, that's the longest I've ever owned like a single iPad and used it as like my daily for making video thumbnails, which is what all iPads have been good for basically since 2015. And yes, it can do some light video editing, but Apple kind of restricts a lot of the capability with those third-party apps, and of course there's no Final Cut support still. LumaFusion is great, but you can only do so much when that time head is fixed in your timeline. And again, it runs really, really well on the A12X chip from 2018, so I'm sure it runs slightly better on the M1, but there's just very little reasons to upgrade for that. And I know there's going to be new iPad Pros next year and probably new iPad Pros a couple years after that, but I've owned this thing for over 3 years and I've yet to find a single reason to upgrade it. As long as there's not really any Mac type of functionality on this thing, as in, I don't care if it's dual booting macOS or just bringing more Mac features like external webcams, more customizable audio input methods, or external monitor support that isn't just screen mirroring, you know, that can actually scale to an additional monitor. I think I could hold on to it for another 3 to 5 years. I really can't fathom anything Apple could do. You know, we're hearing about, okay, titanium chassis around the edges. All right, hopefully that means it's less bendable. Maybe they'll have a glass back for wireless charging, but you're gonna use this thing with a folio cover or a Magic Keyboard case anyway, so trying to put a MagSafe connector on the back here is gonna be awkward. Maybe they put MagSafe 3 from the MacBook Pro on here, but kind of a weird reason to upgrade your entire iPad over, and USB-C is the best port anyway. I prefer charging through Type-C because I have lots of those cables around anyway, so I'm trying to figure out, like, what would get me to upgrade my iPad Pro, and I just once again come back to the software at the end of the day, which now I'm having an even harder time believing that if they added a dual boot option, I would consider upgrading, because now I have my MacBook Pro, and these new ones are so good. Like, the M1 Pro is already insanely fast. Even on the binned base model option, you're getting an insane amount of graphics and CPU performance, especially on a chip that runs that efficiently. So here's my mindset. Like, okay, the iPad Pros have Apple Silicon in them, right? As far as we're aware, they're pretty comfortable giving them the MacBook Air level of chips. That's why we have the M1 on the current iPad Pros, and maybe next year we'll get the M2 chip. The same chip that goes in the refreshed MacBook Air that might find its way into Mac Mini will also go in the iPad Pro, but alright, if I want to start maxing out some of the storage configurations, because I want that extra 16 gigs of RAM or whatnot, I gotta spend like $2,000 to get the keyboard case and the storage options I want, and at that point, I'm basically already at the pricing of MacBook Pros, which actually has fully fledged macOS with, you know, terminal commands and Xcode and Logic and Final Cut and an adequate Finder file system, and those MacBook Pros are gonna be rocking faster silicon than whatever the iPad Pro might get in the future. So, especially in my specific use case, which I know is not a common one, I have bought a 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Max chip, and unless Apple really cares about having insane overhead on the iPad, I don't think the M1 Max is coming to the iPad anytime soon. I shouldn't say that, I'm gonna jinx it. Next year they're gonna be like, well, you know, the iPad needs even more power because overhead, right? And we want it to age really well, so we just keep stuffing more powerful crap in there. But I think the power consumption of the M1 Pro and M1 Max alone would prevent them from putting it in the iPad. Theoretically, they could make it work, but yeah, as much as I've ranted in the past about how I would love having, you know, an iPhone Pro Max camera built into the iPad, it's not likely, it's not rumored, and because Apple likes keeping the iPads thin and light and people are already kind of mad at the current camera bump, it's unlikely that they'll actually give the iPad that much camera performance upgrades. Plus, if I was trying to use an iPhone as my dedicated camera regularly, the iPhone is just far more compact and portable. I can just throw it in my pocket, whereas this is gonna take up some more space, and if I'm gonna be video editing on the go, I'm gonna prefer the MacBook Pro because it's got the larger trackpad, it's got better speakers, it's got a bigger display, it's got a better display, honestly, and what's changed from the previous videos where I've said I could justify upgrading my iPad Pro if the software was there, is that now, even if Apple did exactly what I want, even if Apple was like, okay, Drew from Tailosive Tech, we love your videos, we have decided to allow macOS as a dual booting option on these next generation iPad Pros, which means now you can have one device that lets you edit your video thumbnails, and you can have Final Cut and OBS, and you can plug in external cameras with it and everything. Of course, there's center stage. Even if they did all that, it would still be rocking an M2 or an M3 chip, which is going to be less powerful compared to whatever is currently available in an equally priced MacBook, whether it's M2 Pro or M2 Max. So in my view, the iPad line struggles to find purpose over $1,000. I know there's a lot of you out there that are like, I like using my iPad for YouTube and Twitter, and I use it for browsing the web, and it does fine. Yeah, all of that stuff you can do with sub $1,000 iPads. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the iPad Pro line has had less and less justification now moving forward, particularly the larger screen size, which is now substantially more expensive than the 11-inch model. And once the 11-inch model gets mini LED, that will probably come along with a price hike as well. And even if Apple did, my dream scenario for the iPad Pro, I wouldn't really see a point in upgrading because this edits my video thumbnails feels great, and this can still do everything the new iPads can, just slightly slower at exporting, but I don't know that many people that find the A12X chip slow. I edited a whole tech video on this very iPad earlier in the year, and it did great now that it supports ProRes, but of course, Final Cut is always going to handle that better. So for those wondering, like, what would get me to upgrade my iPad Pro, my answer is, I don't know. I think at this point, I'm genuinely just going to hold on to this thing until it stops getting software updates, and even then, I haven't really loved what they've done with iPadOS in recent history. It feels like they've kind of ruined my home screen. They've added extra dots to the top of apps that I didn't want to be there. They've added quick notes, which I don't really care much about or use very frequently, so even if this stops getting software updates, I'm not even sure if I'll upgrade it then, because the 2018 iPad Pro was just so insanely ahead of its time. Very difficult to beat. I love Face ID, I love USB-C, and the fact that you can get this very iPad for under $700 through Apple Certified Refurbished, and you get the full warranty, you get a fresh battery, you get new glass and everything. I just have a very insanely difficult time recommending anybody get the 2021 iPad Pros now, especially, like, even if you're one of those guys that are like, I need LiDAR, I care about LiDAR on my iPad, get the 2020 iPads, because even those are selling certified refurbished for under $700 now. So I don't know what Apple can do with the iPad anymore, other than make the cheaper ones better. Yeah, like give the iPad 10, you know, USB-C, or give the iPad mini 120 hertz. All that, like, cheaper iPad stuff is great, but as far as being like a plus $1,000 device, yeah, it's really hard to recommend, particularly with these new Macs being so good and old iPads also being so good and now so much cheaper. Hopefully all of that ranting made some sense to you. So how do you guys feel about iPads that start costing well over $1,000? Do they make sense? Is there some kind of software or hardware changes that could make them justifiable now that Macs are so dang good? All that good stuff. Feel free to let me know what you're thinking down below. This is your Alp Sheep here. I'll see you in the next one.